"Sir, I need you to move to seat 32B now." The words sliced through the hum of conversation like a cold blade, sharp, clipped, deliberate, loud enough that even those several rows back turned to watch as Amy Carter, a crisp, uniformed flight attendant in her early 30s, leaned forward, towering over Thomas Jenkins, her eyes firm, her posture unyielding. Tom looked up slowly, his worn baseball cap shadowing tired eyes that had seen more than most could fathom. His right hand, fingers calloused and joints swollen with age and memory, rested on the aisle armrest of seat 14C. The very seat he had reserved months ago, specifically selected for its precious legroom to ease the constant ache in his ruined left knee, a knee shattered 50 years ago on foreign soil and never quite right again. "I booked this seat for medical reasons," Tom said quietly, his voice rough but steady, each syllable carrying the weight of dignity rather than defiance. His brown skin weathered but proud, his back still straight despite the ache that crept up his leg like an old, unwelcome companion. But Amy didn't soften, didn't bend. Her eyes flicked briefly to her tablet and back, cool and efficient, her next words chilling. "If you don't move, sir, we cannot close the cabin doors." The implication was clear, brutal, unmistakable. The other passengers began to look up from their phones and magazines. A hush fell over the forward cabin as curiosity turned quickly to judgment, subtle but cutting, and in that moment, Tom felt their eyes not as glances but as burdens. An old black man refusing to help a young mother with 2 children seated separately, a problem passenger delaying the flight, selfish, obstinate, inconvenient. His breath caught for a moment as he surveyed the scene. The mother standing a few rows ahead with a toddler on her hip and 2 more children clutching the seat backs, looking harried and grateful as Amy cast them a fleeting, reassuring glance. Then back to Tom, her stance expectant, her tone tightening further as she added, "Please, sir, we have to go." For an instant, Tom thought of saying no again, of standing his ground, not out of stubbornness but necessity, because he knew exactly what seat 32B would mean. Trapped between strangers, no room to extend his bad leg, a 5-hour prison of pulsing pain. But he also felt the heat of collective disapproval rising around him, the rustle of impatient travelers shifting in their seats, the silent accusation clear on every face. He saw it all in a single sweep of his tired eyes. The fidgeting couple across the aisle exchanging a glance, the suited man 2 rows back shaking his head subtly as if to say, "Just move already," and even the younger passengers who didn't look up but whose ears were tuned to the tension now hanging heavy in the air. The moment was humiliating, sharp-edged, and public, the kind that cuts deep because no one seemed to care why he needed that seat, only that he was delaying their schedule. With a quiet exhale, Tom Jenkins reached for the seatbelt buckle, his hand trembling slightly, not from frailty but from the deep ache of resignation. Unclasped it, and began the painful process of standing, one hand gripping the seat in front of him for balance, his left leg stiff, his face expressionless, but his pride bleeding quietly beneath the surface. And as he finally limped past Amy Carter toward the back of the plane, toward seat 32B near the lavatories where turbulence and cramped quarters awaited him, a chilling silence followed him down the aisle. No one said a word. No one offered help. No one offered thanks. The mother cast him a brief, grateful smile, unaware or unwilling to see the price he would pay, and Amy merely nodded perfunctorily as he passed, her eyes already scanning for her next task. And behind it all, like a shadow stretching across the cabin, there was the cold indifference of the crowd. A silence louder than any words, watchful, complicit, and damning. Somewhere deep in Tom's chest, behind the weariness and the pain, something fragile and precious. Dignity hard-earned over decades began to splinter. quietly under the weight of that gaze. But hidden 3 rows away, unnoticed by most, Margaret Scott watched every moment unfold, her sharp, steady gaze following Tom as he shuffled painfully past her row, and with one slow, deliberate movement she reached for her phone, not to scroll idly or to post on social media, but to act, because she understood something others had forgotten. Injustice begins in silence, and it thrives in indifference. The flight had not even left the ground, but already Tom Jenkins felt smaller, unseen, dismissed. He did not know that 10 minutes later, everything would change. Seat 32B was exactly as Tom Jenkins imagined, a cramped middle seat between a college student lost in his headphones and a businessman already marking his territory with elbows spread wide, tapping furiously on a laptop balanced precariously on the tray table. The overhead light above him flickered intermittently, casting a pale glow on the threadbare upholstery, and the stale scent of overused air filters mixed with faint cleaning fluid hung heavy, a constant reminder that this was not the place he had chosen. Tom lowered himself slowly, every movement measured, every inch of descent punctuated by a sharp ache that radiated from his knee up to his hip, the pain settling like an old adversary who knew exactly when to strike. His leg bent too tightly beneath the narrow space, unable to stretch or shift, trapped between the seat back in front of him and the indifferent bodies on either side, strangers who did not look at him, did not speak, did not care. The businessman to his left did not acknowledge Tom's presence beyond a quick, irritated glance as Tom settled in, his elbow already reclaiming the shared armrest without apology. The young man on the right stayed immersed in his movie, volume turned high, gaze fixed firmly away from the discomfort beside him. Tom clasped his weathered hands over his stomach, fingers interlocked, knuckles swollen and rough, and closed his eyes. Not in rest, but in resignation, allowing himself to disappear into the anonymity of this middle seat, into the harsh quiet of collective indifference, into the familiar ache of being overlooked. His knee throbbed steadily now, the sharp pulse of pain matching the rhythm of his heartbeat, and he shifted slightly to relieve the pressure, but found no escape, no relief, no space to breathe. He could feel the judgment that still lingered from earlier, could sense the subtle shift in cabin air when he passed by, the silent narrative that had already painted him as a stubborn old man unwilling to help, a caricature of inconvenience in the eyes of passengers too hurried to ask why he had needed that aisle seat in the first place. But as the cabin filled with noise, overhead bins slamming shut, seat belts clicking, voices murmuring about schedules and connections, there was one person who did not look away: Margaret Scott. From her seat 3 rows forward and across the aisle, Margaret sat perfectly still, her laptop unopened on her tray, her sharp blue eyes following Tom's every movement with quiet intensity. She had watched Amy Carter's approach, had noted every clipped word, every subtle pressure applied to force compliance, had seen Tom's hesitation, his measured politeness, his reluctant rise and painful shuffle toward the back of the aircraft, and she had felt the sting of injustice like a personal wound. Margaret was not a stranger to these moments. She had lived long enough, traveled often enough, to recognize when a person was being asked to sacrifice dignity for convenience, and she knew instinctively that this was such a moment. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone, not to capture a photo, not to post indignantly online, but to act with precision and purpose. Her fingers moved deftly, opening her contacts, selecting a name near the top of her list, a senior executive at the very airline they were sitting in, someone she knew professionally and trusted personally. Her message was brief but sharp, the kind of note that carried weight because it was both factual and urgent. Passenger Thomas Jenkins, veteran, displaced from aisle seat 14C despite medical need. Now in 32B, visibly uncomfortable. Crew dismissive. Please escalate immediately. Flight 2673, Denver to Annapolis. She hit send and placed her phone face down on the tray table, her gaze drifting back to Tom, still seated rigidly, still silent, still unseen by all except her. The final boarding call echoed over the intercom as flight attendants moved through the aisles with quick efficiency, checking seatbelts, straightening bags, ensuring tray tables were stowed. But no one paused at 32B to acknowledge Tom Jenkins. No one thought to apologize. No one offered even a glance of sympathy or recognition. Amy Carter passed by him briskly, eyes forward, tablet in hand, her mind already on takeoff protocols and passenger counts, her earlier interaction with Tom seemingly forgotten or ignored. But somewhere beyond the closed cockpit door, in a place where duty still meant something deeper, Captain Robert Lewis sat in his command seat, headset on, reviewing pre-flight checklists, unaware, at least for now, of what had transpired behind him, unaware that a quiet act of disrespect had taken place just steps from where he sat. And in the space of those final minutes before pushback, the quiet ache in Tom Jenkins's knee merged with an older, deeper ache, a familiar hollow he had known before. The ache of being overlooked, undervalued, unseen despite years of sacrifice. For the passengers surrounding him, it was just another flight, just another delay, just another minor inconvenience. But for Tom Jenkins, seated stiffly in 32B, it was something far more profound. A silent reminder that even after all these years, the world could still reduce a man's worth to the space he occupied, or the space he was told to leave. What none of them knew, what even Tom himself could not have foreseen, was that 10 minutes later, the entire cabin would fall silent again. But this time for a very different reason. In the cockpit, Captain Robert Lewis adjusted his headset, his mind already focused on flight checklists and air traffic control clearances. But then, with a soft chime, a notification flashed across his screen. Brief but urgent. A corporate liaison alert, flagged as high priority and tagged with a name he recognized immediately. Margaret Scott. His eyes narrowed as he read the message. Passenger Thomas Jenkins, forcibly displaced from aisle seat despite confirmed booking and medical need. Veteran. Seat 32B, Flight 2673. Please review immediately. Robert's breath caught for a fraction of a second. The practiced calm of a man who had flown thousands of hours momentarily disrupted as the name Jenkins settled heavily in his thoughts. He looked again at the line mentioning veteran and medical need, and something in him hardened. Not in anger, but in resolve. A quiet steel that every military man knows, forged in discipline and duty. "Full taxi," he said calmly to his first officer, who looked over, puzzled, fingers still poised over the engine start sequence. "Captain?" the first officer asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Robert unbuckled his harness deliberately, his movements measured but decisive. "We're holding position. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Inform ground control." Before the co-pilot could object, Robert was already rising from his seat, smoothing his uniform, checking the alignment of his gold stripes, a man stepping from one kind of duty into another, older one, a duty that mattered more than schedules or departure slots. The cockpit door opened with a quiet click, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Passengers felt it before they saw him, an intangible energy moving through the cabin as the tall figure of Captain Robert Lewis stepped into the aisle, his cap in hand, his expression unreadable but commanding. Margaret Scott, seated just a few rows forward, felt her breath catch as their eyes briefly met. No words passed between them. None were needed. He began walking, steady, calm, deliberate, his gaze sweeping the rows until he reached 32B, where Thomas Jenkins sat motionless, hands folded over his lap, eyes half shut in a kind of weary acceptance. Tom felt the shadow before he saw the man, and as he opened his eyes slowly, he was met with a sight he did not expect. Captain Lewis, standing tall, immaculate in uniform, his silver wings glinting softly in the overhead light. Then, without hesitation, Captain Lewis raised his right hand and rendered a crisp, formal salute, a gesture that transformed the very air inside that cabin. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The soft murmur of passengers died into a total hush, a breathless stillness as every eye turned to witness a moment no one had anticipated. Thomas Jenkins blinked in disbelief, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the humiliation he had just endured and this unexpected display of honor. "Staff Sergeant Thomas Jenkins," Captain Lewis said, his voice clear, unwavering, and deliberate, cutting through the heavy silence of the cabin. "On behalf of this airline, this crew, and as a fellow serviceman, I offer you my deepest apologies," he continued, his words weighted with sincerity and the authority of a man who understood exactly what respect meant and what it cost when withheld. Passengers sat up straighter, their earlier judgment dissolving into a mixture of curiosity, embarrassment, and, slowly, respect. "You should not have been asked to move from your seat," Captain Lewis went on. "That was an error, an unacceptable one, and we are going to make this right." His gaze swept toward Amy Carter, who now stood frozen a few rows ahead, tablet clutched to her chest, her face pale as the gravity of the moment settled around her. "Ms. Carter," Captain Lewis said, his tone still calm but unmistakably authoritative, "you will personally escort Staff Sergeant Jenkins to seat 1A. Amy hesitated, her lips parting as if to object, but no words came, and Captain Lewis continued before she could speak. "If 1A is occupied, ask for a volunteer. If no one volunteers, you will explain that the captain of this aircraft is requesting that seat on behalf of a decorated combat veteran. If that fails—" He paused briefly, letting the silence deepen. "I will give up my own seat." Ripple of surprise passed through the cabin, subtle but profound. Passengers who had averted their eyes just minutes ago now watched intently, some with a dawning sense of shame, others with growing admiration, as the captain extended his hand toward Tom Jenkins, not as a superior officer but as an equal, as a man who understood exactly what it meant to stand for another. Tom sat frozen for a heartbeat longer, unsure whether his aching body could rise again, unsure whether he should trust this unexpected shift in fortune. But then, slowly, deliberately, he placed his hands on the seat in front of him and began to rise. Captain Lewis stepped forward, steadying him with a firm hand beneath his elbow, a small gesture that carried immeasurable weight. And for the first time since he had been told to move, Tom Jenkins felt visible again. The businessman who had dominated the shared armrest now shrank back awkwardly, eyes lowered, his earlier indifference transformed into discomfort. The college student to Tom's right pulled off his headphones hastily, mumbling a quiet, "Sorry, sir," though Tom had never demanded an apology. As they turned toward the front of the plane, Captain Lewis glanced once more toward Margaret Scott, who met his gaze with the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement between two people who had chosen not to look away. And as Tom began his slow, careful walk up the aisle, every row he passed felt the weight of his steps. Not a word was spoken, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The same passengers who moments before had dismissed him as an inconvenience now watched in silence, some ashamed, some moved, and all aware that they were witnessing something they would remember long after this flight had landed. The aisle seemed longer than ever as Tom Jenkins moved slowly forward, every step deliberate, every shift of his stiff knee sharp and precise. But he no longer walked with the quiet resignation of a man dismissed. Instead, he walked with dignity restored, steady under the weight of Captain Lewis's guiding hand beneath his elbow. The passengers he passed did not speak, but their eyes followed him now, not with impatience or judgment, but with something deeper, more honest, a quiet recognition that a wrong had just been confronted before their eyes. As they reached the front of the cabin, Amy Carter stood awkwardly to the side, tablet clutched tightly against her chest like a shield, her usual polished efficiency stripped away, replaced by a visible unease as Captain Lewis addressed her directly. "Seat 1A?" Her voice was smaller than before, almost hesitant, as she turned to the man seated comfortably in 1A. A middle-aged traveler in a pressed polo shirt, sipping bottled water, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding behind him. "I'm sorry, sir," Amy began, her voice faltering slightly. "We need to reassign your seat. Captain's request." The man blinked, confused at first, but then turned and saw Tom Jenkins standing just behind her, the age in his face, the quiet exhaustion in his shoulders, the gold stripes on Captain Lewis's sleeve as he waited beside the old man. And in that instant, without hesitation, the man in 1A nodded slowly and stood. "Sir," he said quietly to Tom, "it's an honor. No complaint, no argument, just simple respect." Captain Lewis offered the slightest nod in return as Amy stepped aside to guide Tom toward the now vacant seat. But before Tom could lower himself into the wide leather chair, the captain turned and addressed the entire front cabin in a voice designed to be heard by all. "If that seat had not been given," he said calmly, his gaze sweeping from row to row, "I would have reassigned my co-pilot's jump seat." A beat of silence passed. "And if that had not been available," he continued, his voice steady and deliberate, "I would have given up mine." The meaning of those words sank in immediately, rippling across the rows like a tide. This wasn't simply a seat reassignment, it was a correction of something deeper, a refusal to allow dishonor to linger quietly in the shadows of convenience. Tom finally eased himself down into seat 1A, the leather soft and cool beneath him, his stiff knee able to extend freely at last. But it wasn't just the comfort of the space that mattered. It was the restoration of dignity in front of all who had watched him be diminished moments before. Amy Carter stepped back into the galley wordlessly, her face pale, her confidence visibly shaken, while the passengers in rows 1 through 6 sat straighter, aware now of the gravity of what had just transpired, their initial silence replaced with a growing sense of reverence. In that moment, just as the cabin doors were about to close, a young man further back in the plane, a passenger who had remained silent through it all, stood up suddenly, his voice trembling slightly as he called out, "Staff Sergeant Jenkins!" Tom turned his head slowly, his expression wary but curious. The man, in his late 30s, wore jeans and a hoodie, a ball cap clutched in his hand as he stepped into the aisle. "I served under you," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Camp Leatherneck, 2006. You saved my life." Gasps swept quietly through the surrounding rows as the man's voice broke entirely. He blinked rapidly, swallowing hard, and simply added, "We never got to thank you, sir." A profound silence fell, thick and heavy but warm in its weight. Tom Jenkins' jaw tensed, his chest rising and falling once in a deep, controlled breath as his gaze locked with the younger man's, and slowly his hardened expression softened into something more human, more vulnerable. He dipped his head gently, the faintest trace of emotion flickering in his tired eyes. The younger man gave a single, respectful nod, then sat down again quickly, his head bowed, tears pooling silently on his cheeks as he fumbled with his cap. Around them, the atmosphere in the cabin changed yet again, shifting from curiosity to respect, from indifference to understanding. Captain Lewis turned quietly toward the intercom, adjusting the handset as he prepared to speak, not just to the passengers, but to everyone who had witnessed this story unfold in silence. His voice came through clear and deliberate, every word chosen with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we depart, I have an announcement to make. A hush swept the plane, every conversation ceasing as heads turned toward the sound of his voice. "Today, a mistake was made on this aircraft," Captain Lewis continued. "A man who served this country, a man who carries both the visible and invisible scars of that service, was asked to give up his seat. Not because of an airline error, but because of a policy that prioritized convenience over honor." He paused briefly, allowing the words to sink in. "Let me be clear," he said. "We will not take off while injustice sits quietly in this cabin." Every passenger listened now with a different kind of attention, their earlier impatience transformed into something more reflective, more personal. "He," Captain Lewis continued, his voice softening but never wavering, "Staff Sergeant Thomas Jenkins is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply asked to keep the seat he booked so his leg wouldn't lock up from a service injury." Another beat of silence followed, a silence that spoke volumes. "We failed him," Captain Lewis admitted, his voice steady but resolute. "But we don't leave our own behind. Not in combat, not at 30,000 feet. His final words resonated throughout the cabin like a quiet vow. "And if that means this flight runs 10 minutes late," he said, "then I will take every one of those minutes with pride." With that, he returned the handset to its cradle and stepped back into the aisle, his presence still commanding but now carrying the weight of collective respect. And then, almost hesitantly at first, a single pair of hands began to clap, softly but sincerely, followed by another, then another, until row by row, section by section, applause rolled through the cabin like a wave. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forced, but it was genuine. For the first time in a long, long while, Thomas Jenkins felt truly seen. He didn't raise a hand, didn't bow his head. He simply sat quietly in seat 1A, dignity intact, pain acknowledged, honor restored. And as the applause swelled gently around him, every passenger on that flight knew, without doubt, that something profound had just happened. The flight landed in Annapolis just after noon, the wheels kissing the runway with a gentle hum, sunlight streaming through the windows as if blessing this particular journey, a journey that had become far more than a simple connection between cities. Passengers rose slowly from their seats, collecting belongings, checking devices for notifications, but many stole quiet glances toward 1A, where Thomas Jenkins remained seated, hands resting calmly on his knees, no rush in his manner, no urgency in his breath. For once he did not feel like an afterthought. For once he did not feel invisible. When he finally rose, moving carefully with that familiar stiffness in his left knee, the flight crew at the cabin door did not simply murmur polite platitudes. They met his eyes directly, and when they thanked him, they meant it. Beyond the jet bridge, near baggage claim, his granddaughter, Emily Jenkins, waited, midshipman uniform pressed sharp, her posture as straight and proud as the family legacy she was preparing to inherit. Her handmade sign, "Welcome, Grandpa Tom," wobbled slightly in her grasp as she spotted him, and then she dropped it altogether and ran. He did not brace for impact. He let her embrace him fully, a force of youth and joy colliding into a body aged but unbroken. When she finally pulled back, her eyes glistening, she glanced down at his stiff leg and whispered, "Your knee." Tom smiled softly. The kind of smile that starts deep inside and works its way up slowly. A smile that, for the first time in a long while, reached his eyes. "I've had worse," he said simply, his tone warm but steady. That afternoon they sat together for hours, side by side on a quiet bench outside her dormitory, sunlight dancing across the polished stone at their feet. She told him about her studies, her ship assignment, her dreams of command, while he listened carefully, content to be present, content to let her words fill the quiet spaces between them. She asked gently about what had happened on the flight, referencing the confused texts and notifications already appearing on her phone. Tom kept it simple, almost too simple. "I had a bad seat," he said with a faint twinkle in his eye, "and someone stood up." Later that evening, alone in her room, Emily scrolled through social media and found the video, the one another passenger had quietly recorded, showing Captain Lewis's measured speech over the intercom, showing her grandfather being saluted, honored, and guided to seat 1A with respect. She cried then, not for the pain he had endured, but for the grace with which he carried it, and the quiet dignity that finally received its due. And when she hugged him again the next day, she did so with both arms wrapped tightly around his frame, unwilling to let go. In the weeks that followed, Thomas Jenkins began receiving letters. The first came from Transcontinental Airlines, a formal apology and a full refund for the flight. But enclosed was something else, a card designating him as a lifetime guest of honor. No more booking codes, no more fees. "Just tell us where you're going," the card read, "and we'll get you there." He folded the letter twice, carefully, and placed it beside the small folded flag that had sat on his mantel for decades, a quiet symbol of the life he had lived and the comrades he had lost. A second letter arrived not long after, this one hand-addressed, bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside, a brief but powerful note informed him that, following a public inquiry, his long-overlooked action report from Vietnam had been restored. A report detailing how Staff Sergeant Thomas Jenkins had, while gravely wounded himself, pulled 6 Marines from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. The letter closed with a handwritten postscript. "Thomas, I was one of those 6. I made it home. I built a life because of what you did. You were never invisible, not to us." It was signed simply, General J. Lockhart, USMC. Tom sat with that letter for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his calloused fingers, the sunlight falling softly across his lap as he stared out the window. Not with sadness, but with a quiet peace that settled deeper than words could reach. And far away, in a quiet study in Richmond, Virginia, Margaret Scott sat at her desk, writing steadily. Not embellishing, not dramatizing, but recording the story exactly as it had happened. Her account was picked up first by a small regional publication, then by national outlets. Within days, the salute at 32B became a headline read aloud at school assemblies, reprinted in veterans' halls, shared around family dinner tables. A photo of Tom Jenkins sitting quietly in seat 1A, sunlight falling gently on his weathered hands, became something of an icon, not of fame, but of remembrance. And Tom Jenkins? He did not change much after that. He still lived in his modest house in Rock Springs, still limped to the mailbox each morning, even when it hurt, still drank his coffee black and watched the dusk settle over the hills. But inside, something had shifted. A small but vital shift. His shoulders sat just a little straighter when he walked down Main Street. He didn't flinch when strangers approached anymore. And sometimes, when he sat quietly on the porch as the sun dipped low, he smiled, not out of pride, but out of something even simpler, the knowledge that, for once, he had truly been seen. Because not all sacrifices are marked by medals. Not all battles end with banners. But sometimes all it takes is one person standing up, one voice breaking silence for dignity to return, and when that happens, even a single seat becomes sacred. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, even in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps seeks recognition, some simply know when it's time to act. And sometimes, that's enough to change a life. If this story touched you, take a moment today to remember the quiet heroes around you. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever forgotten.